Hey, welcome back. Good morning. Well, at least where I'm at, good morning. As usual, welcome to Not Legal Advice. But if you are on any platform other than YouTube, you may see a shortened version of this video. So to see the whole thing, I encourage you to go to YouTube, check it out, see the whole video. Hopefully it's helpful. Like, subscribe, share, force your family and friends to do the same. And I appreciate it. So August 17th, 2024, Saturday, coming up, big day, big day in the real estate world, right? So if you are a real estate agent or anybody at any way at all connected with real estate, especially residential real estate, I'm sure you have heard that the National Association of Realtors entered into a gigantic settlement agreement with plaintiffs that were alleging that the way that commissions were paid on residential real estate were inflating prices and violating antitrust rules. So, and this stems from a case, I believe in Missouri, where a pretty significant jury award was handed down, but all that led to where we are today. So the National Association of Realtors enters into the settlement agreement that changes the way and the rules by which buyer's agents specifically are compensated, and that starts Saturday. So again, August 17th coming up, a few days from now. Make sure you understand what the rules are, what you can and cannot do. So first thing is that the settlement agreement covers you if you're part of NAR, National Association of Realtors. If you're unclear, check with your broker, check with your lawyer, but these are the rules. So number one is offers of compensation. So what we would call co-op, right? That you're going to co-op with buyer's agents. If you're a listing agent, what that percentage would be, that kind of thing, can no longer be on MLS. And my understanding is that MLS will not even allow you to put it on there anymore. But you cannot put offers of compensation to buyer's agents on MLS anymore, starting on the 17th. I would also recommend or discourage you from putting them in the realtor comments. I would just keep them off MLS altogether. So that's point number one. You can make offers of compensation off of MLS. Some of the comments that we have read imply that it should be further than one click away. So if your MLS listing has some sort of hyperlink in it that an agent clicks on, and it immediately takes them to an offer of compensation as far as what you're going to co-op with a buyer's agent, bad idea. So you can have it on your personal web page, your Facebook page, your social media, but I would distance it from MLS. And I know this is going to result in 1,000,001 phone calls, probably starting Saturday, to every listing agent of, will you co-op? Will you co-op? How much? That kind of thing. But that's what we have. So number one, no offers of compensation on MLS. Keep them off MLS, and that's point number one. Point number two is you now need signed contracts or signed agreements with buyers. If you are going to work with a buyer, and that, I'll dive into what that means, you are required to have a signed buyer's agreement before you tour a home with them. And touring a home is both obviously an in-person tour, but in this wonderful world of phones, it would include like a FaceTime tour. It would include a virtual tour, a live virtual tour. So where the agent is showing the house virtually to a client who is not physically present, that counts. So before any type of tour, you have to have this buyer agreement signed. Working with a buyer. So what does that mean? That means you're representing the buyer, right? You're doing the things that a normal buyer's agent would do. You're setting up showings, you're showing them properties, you're submitting offers, you're representing the buyer. So it's more than just taking a deposit. So in those two scenarios, you're working with a buyer, they're going to tour a home, get your buyer's agreement signed. In fact, I would even say, even if you're not going to tour a home, right? There are people still buying homes sight unseen. Best practice, get a buyer's agreement signed. So a couple of things that need to be in the buyer's agreement. The biggest one, and this is kind of where that Missouri case came from, and the settlement agreement, is you must be clear on the compensation. So has to be able to be objectively measured, and that's just a fancy way of saying easily calculated based upon the language in the document. So for example, a percentage of the purchase price. If it's 3%, it's 2%, very easily calculated. So that's a good one. Number two would be a flat fee, $10,000. Absolutely great. Now, the settlement allows some flexibility in how that compensation is structured. So it allows for you to use an hourly rate. It allows for you to use some sort of combination or blended fixed fee, flat fee, part compensation. I think those are all bad ideas. I would, I would lean towards either a percentage or a flat fee. I think those are going to save people a lot of headache and create a lot fewer arguments. You start charging people an hourly fee. Now you have to track those hours. You've got to have some reporting mechanisms. You're of course going to get questions about, are those hours reasonable? Did you spend too much time, not enough time? I shouldn't have to pay that amount. So I think an hourly rate for real estate is a terrible idea. So I wouldn't go that route. Wouldn't blend anything. I think you're just, asking for trouble if you do that. So if it's me and I'm representing a buyer, it's flat fee, it's flat percentage. That's where I'm at. It definitely can't be something ambiguous or open-ended like whatever seller agrees to. So don't put anything like that. Number two, as far as what needs to be in these agreements besides the compensation, is a prohibition, right? You can't receive any compensation as a buyer's agent above and beyond what is set forth in the agreement. So, common scenario, you put 2% is what you're going to represent the buyer for, 2% of the purchase price. You make an offer on a property, the seller is going to co-op 3%. They won't reduce, the purchase price. They're for whatever reason, they're stuck at co-oping at 3%. Your buyer's agreement says 2%. You are capped at 2%. You cannot take 3% commission on that. Now the exception would be you can go and amend or update your buyer's agreement to reflect the higher commission of 3%, and then you would be able to receive that higher co-op. So you can't take any compensation above what's in your buyer's agreement, no matter who the source is. So beware of that. There's got to be disclosures in these agreements. So point number three, there's got to be disclosures. It's bold, it's larger font, it's all caps, something like that, that says, all these fees are negotiable. They're not set by law. That's supposed to be the magic language that alerts or at least notifies your buyer that this is an arm's length negotiation transaction where both parties are negotiating to figure out what's the right fee for you to represent them in their home search. So that's got to be in there. You cannot, this is tricky, this is why the timing is important, you cannot delay delivery or submission of any type of offer on behalf of your buyer just because you don't have this buyer's addendum, or this buyer's agreement, I'm sorry. You can't just, you can't delay that part of the process because you're still working on negotiating compensation with your buyer. So again, my opinion, best practice, you get out there the second you are connecting with a buyer and they've agreed that they want you to represent them, you get this buyer's agreement signed before you do anything else. Oh, there we go, look at that, weather report. Anyway, the idea being, don't let yourself get into a situation where a buyer is telling you, hey, I want to hire you, please submit an offer, here's the offer, without this agreement. Get this agreement in place before you engage. You do not need, so okay, this is more for listing agents. So if you're a listing agent, you're having an open house, you do not need a buyer's agreement so long as you're not representing a buyer. So if they're unrepresented and you're not going to represent them, you don't need a buyer's agreement. If they are represented but they just want to tour the house and their agent's not there, you don't need a buyer's agreement. You don't need it for that. You're not representing the buyer. So if you remember, if you're working with a buyer, then you need the buyer's agreement. In that scenario, as a listing agent on an open house, in theory, at least you're not working with the buyer. Now, if you become a dual agent, and now you're representing seller and you're representing buyer, well, in that case, you have to get a buyer's agreement, just like if you were only representing buyers. So again, the second you're working with a buyer, get a buyer's agreement signed. Going back to the MLS thing for 1 second. So we said, you can't put offers of compensation on the buyers on the MLS for buyer's agents, but you can put seller concessions, which are going to be different, right? Your closing costs, points when they used to do that kind of thing. But don't allow yourself to get sucked into trying to hide offers of compensation for buyer's agents within your seller concessions. Keep those separate, keep them clear. Do not fall into that trap. Steering based upon broker compensation or offers of compensation, again, prohibited. Steering was prohibited before, it's prohibited now. I think the biggest thing that's going to at least stop that on some level, and I may be wrong, it's happened once before in my life, is the cap on the compensation for the buyer's agent. So if you're capped at X%, then it doesn't really matter what seller's offering, right? So, but obviously no steering. Something on the listing agent side as well that you want to be aware of. So the listing agent does need seller approval before they offer to co-op or pay any buyer's agent, or before they actually pay any buyer's agent. So you do need approval from your seller before you, again, make this offer to co-op or actually, pay a buyer's agent. I think that it should be in writing. I think you should have it ahead of time. Seller authorizes a listing agent to co-op up to 3% of the purchase price or 2% of the purchase price. But, to keep yourself safe as a listing agent, every time you get a request from a buyer's agent to co-op, because that's what's going to happen, right? They're going to write, and buyer's agents write, this is what you're going to do. You're going to write it into your additional terms and conditions, seller to pay 3% or whatever it is you're going to do. Listing agent's going to get those offers. Listing agent, I always recommend you contact your seller, I know you do anyway, and say, hey, here's the offer or multiple offers. Here's the request for cooperation or compensation to be paid to the buyer's agent. Can I have your approval or rejection or counteroffer, however you're going to do that? But I would definitely recommend getting that approval in writing, getting it prior. If you are a realtor that only uses text versus email, I would again recommend maybe saving that text message, screenshotting it, dropping it into a digital file, something like that. You gotta save that because when disputes happen, and eventually they do, it is very concerning, frustrating, and expensive when people can't find cell phone records or text message threads are deleted and they're not stored or archived anywhere, or phones get updated. So you want to protect against that. You want to protect yourself. So create a nice little digital or even hard copy file anytime you're getting approval from a seller with respect to a transaction. So that is the NAR settlement. Now Ohio passed a law this year, 2024, which was called House Bill 466, that takes the NAR settlement, essentially codifies parts of it into law, and then adds a few different nuances. So it's amending, I think, Ohio Revised Code, section 4735, a couple of sections in there, but it does, again, it requires the written agreements with your buyers. But this one is specific that it must include a expiration date, so it has to have a specific term or duration in the agreement. And then it has to have fair housing information. It has to specify whether your relationship with your buyer is exclusive or non-exclusive. And then obviously it has to have those terms of compensation. So, 2 cents on that. And something you really want to be sure that you communicate to your buyer is if the relationship is non-exclusive. So if they're utilizing multiple buyer's agents, then the buyer could be on the hook for commission to multiple agents, so multiple brokers. You want to be careful of that. So the documents that came out from Ohio Realtors, Columbus Border Realtors, and I'm sure other ones out there, they are usually asking for some sort of affirmation or representation from the buyer that says that they are or are not entering into other buyer's agreements. So they want the documents need to clarify whether the relationship is exclusive. Number two is, and this is kind of an interesting caveat, but the way that these buyer's agreements are written, your buyer's on the hook for commission. So if the seller doesn't pay it, your buyer's on the hook. They owe the commission. There's language in these agreements that talks about, in this scenario where well, I guess there's three different scenarios. Number one would be the seller pays the exact amount of commission that the buyer owes you under the buyer's agreement. Then the buyer's responsibility is zeroed out. So they don't owe anything. So your buyer's agreement says 3%. Your seller pays 3%. Buyer doesn't owe anything. You get your 3%. In a scenario where the seller pays less than what the buyer owes you. So your buyer's agreement says 3%, but your seller's agreement says 2%. Buyer's on the hook for the remaining 1%. So they need to understand that, they need to be aware of that. That's what the agreement says. And then the last scenario where the seller pays you more than what your buyer's agreement says. So buyer's agreement says 2%, the seller pays 3%. Super strange that would happen. But in that scenario, you cannot keep the 1%. So 1% goes to the buyer, 1% comes off the purchase price, 1% stays with the seller. That's going to be a point of negotiation. Like, no, I don't think anybody's going to show up to closing and be surprised by, oh my gosh, we got an extra 1% out there. It's not going to be the case, but be aware of that. Make sure your buyer's aware of that. That says, hey, look, as your buyer's agent, I am capped at whatever compensation we put in this agreement. And anything above that, I can't keep. Anything below that, buyer, you have to pay. Unless, of course, you as the magnanimous real estate agent that you are, waive it or give it up. But you may want to make sure your broker is on board with whatever strategy you involve there. So again, two huge components. Number one, no more offers of compensation on MLS. So it's going to generate a lot more phone calls, a lot more texts, a lot more emails to find out if sellers are offering to pay buyer's agents and what percentage or what amount. And then number two, written buyer's agreements must be entered into when you're working with a buyer before you tour any property. And the biggest component is that compensation piece. So be aware, understand what's going on out there. Good luck on Saturday. Last couple of points, because I love to talk and I get paid by the word. If you have listing agreements that are not in contract by the 17th, you need to do an updated listing agreement. I believe there's a new one that just came out. You need to do a new listing agreement with your seller, okay? Obviously, if you have buyers that you're already working with, starting on the 17th, no matter how long you've been working with them, even if they're related to you, if you're going to continue working with them, you have to sign a buyer's agreement. So, be prepared for those conversations this weekend and going forward. And yeah, good luck out there. All right, bye.